This is an account of something bizarre and completely mental that happened to me a few years back when I got my first car. I was 20 years old, and after much reluctance to get some driving lessons, I finally gave in. Growing up, I'd been more of a cycling man, and as far as I was concerned, there wasn't any place I needed to get to that wasn't in cycling distance. Yes, I was a moron. It was only after losing out on a job I desperately wanted because they required you to have a valid driving license that I finally saw sense. Still makes me laugh now, as the job was in office administration, a position of course that didn't need me to drive as far as I could see, but I don't make up the rules, I guess. So shortly after passing my test, and my father surprised me by giving me his own Ford Mondeo. I was so surprised by this kind gesture, as I was always aware of how much he loved the car. "It's that car Bond drives in Casino Royale," he would mention time and time again. "How can I afford the insurance on an engine of this size?" I asked my dad, being careful not to sound like I wasn't thrilled with the gift. "Oh, it's fine, I'll pay the insurance if you promise to be my chauffeur whenever I need a lift home from the pub because I'll be too shit-faced to drive," he said proudly. Needless to say, I was completely overjoyed. I spent my first few months driving anywhere, even to places I didn't really require me to drive. I would often take short trips around the corner to the store, and of course, I would spend time chauffeuring around the old man, as was stated in our deal. I hadn't realized how many hobbies both my parents had until I had to drive them. Sometime later, I applied for and got an office job at a business park outside of the city. I loved this, as it meant I got to drive through the country roads on my way to work each morning. There's nothing quite like driving past farmland with your windows open while listening to a little John Denver in the early hours. My music choice was partly because my father left his CDs in the glove compartment, and partly because I dig the classics. As with most things, though, the novelty of the car began to fade as my responsibilities grew. I still loved to drive, but it was mainly to and from work only, as I lived in the city and most things like shopping or meeting up with friends was within walking distance. We're now coming to the reason I'm writing this story, and not meaning to sound cliché, but it all started like a relatively normal morning. I woke up at 6 a.m. to the sounds of birds chirping. After a quick shower and breakfast, I was already sat in my car at 6:45 fiddling with my phone's Bluetooth. I had been given a kit by a friend the night before when he stated I'd be able to play music from my phone via the car's radio without using an auxiliary cord, but I was failing miserably. No matter how much I tried, the Bluetooth just refused to connect, and I ended up settling on another one of my dad's CDs. As I pulled off the dual carriageway, I took a junction that led out into rural countryside. I could breathe a little easier now as I was out of the city's early morning congestion. I still had 20 minutes of drive time, so as with most mornings, I cranked up the radio. As I sat there listening to Annie's song, and watching as vertical white bars disappeared under the car's bonnet, something caught my eye in the car's rearview mirror. Right behind my passenger seat sat a little boy with a red cap. He just sat there, staring out the window absent-minded. He looked so bored and normal. I know that's a weird thing to note under the circumstance, but it's what I remember thinking at the time. He looked so normal sitting there after my eyes locked on him and they shifted back to the road. It was only after a few seconds that I came to the stark realization that I don't have a kid. Admittedly, I did something you should never do while driving, but fortunately for me, I was heading down a long stretch of road. My head snapped around to the back seat. He was still there, only now his gaze had shifted from the window to me. He looked startled and confused. I guess I must have looked the same way to him. He wore a red cap that sat atop brown curly hair that stuck out from the sides. His eyes were blue and his face was full of freckles. Going by his outfit, he looked like he was either going to or leaving a football game. After a moment of us both looking at each other, I started to notice he was very afraid. Before I could register anything else, I remembered I was driving a damn car. I quickly turned the correct way to find my exit was quickly approaching. I looked back to my mirror. "Where did you—" I began to shout, but stopped when seeing the back seat completely empty. My heart was racing from the fright, so I pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car. I took a few deep breaths and proceeded to walk around the car and even inspect the back seats until I was satisfied there was no sign of a child ever being back there. I wasn't sure what idea scared me more, that a child really had been back there or that I had been hallucinating. The prospect of having hallucinated was a very frightening prospect. It had never happened to me before, and I'm pretty damn sure I hadn't taken anything I shouldn't have. As I stood there in the cold February breeze, with the sound of traffic behind me, I tried to rationalize what had just happened. You see, before any of this had happened to me, I was always a skeptic and I didn't believe in the paranormal, so it wasn't long before I reached the conclusion I had some sort of mental episode. When I got to work, it became apparent that my mind was elsewhere. No matter how many times I attempted to be productive, I couldn't stop thinking about the kid. If he was indeed a hallucination, why him? Why so much detail? It wasn't too long before my supervisor stopped me in the hallway and asked if I was feeling all right as, according to him, I looked a little shaken and not myself. I didn't tell him what had happened, but I asked if I could go home as I wasn't feeling well. He obliged and I quickly got my things to leave. As I made my way outside to the entrance, I breathed in the early morning air. It was cold, but I liked it. The cold was sharp enough to keep me grounded when I felt like I was losing my mind. I slowly made my way across the car park to my Ford before getting in, and I walked around the car a few times again. The car was completely empty. Maybe he sneaked in before you left this morning? My brain tried to rationalize, but it was to no avail. Where did he disappear to then? It interjected. I finally got the courage to sit in the driving seat and put my seatbelt on before taking out my phone and calling my mother. After a few rings, she answered. Hello? Hi, Mom, it's me, I said quietly. Oh, what's happened? She asked. I began to feel tears in my eyes. Ever since I was a child, my mother has always had the ability to know when something was wrong, even when I tried my absolute best to sound fine. How did you know something was wrong? I laughed a little. I've just had a feeling all morning like something bad was going to happen, and you sound upset, she finished. Well, I think I might be unwell or something. I hallucinated this morning. I saw something while driving, and I can't explain, I admitted. It's funny what happens when you give voice to what's worrying you. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders a little as I uttered the words. There was a pause before my mom spoke again. What did you see? She asked cautiously. I'll tell you when I see you. I'll head on over if that's all right. Should be about 20 minutes or so, I finished. Okay, love, I'll put the kettle on, she finished, followed by a click and a dial tone. I smiled and wiped the tears that had accumulated on my cheek and put the key in the ignition. After about 5 minutes, I began to feel more at ease. I had driven along the same stretch of road where I had seen the boy earlier, and nothing happened. Another 5 minutes, and I'd be back in the city and on my way to my parents' house. Just then, my heart sank completely. Who are you? Asked the young voice behind me. I have never felt so much dread in my life, the sort of dread you feel in the pit of your stomach. I suddenly went numb as my gaze began to shift, leaving the road, up over my dashboard, and up to my mirror. The boy sat in the chair with his seatbelt fastened and his hands folded in his lap, and a bright red cap beaming a Coca-Cola logo. His look was one of confusion and fear as he stared at me through the rearview mirror. Just then, as my stress was about reaching breaking point, I decided it best to pull over again. This time I made as much effort to do so while keeping my eyes on the little boy. The car came to a halt in a lay-by of a surprisingly empty bus shelter. Thank God, I thought. Last thing I wanted right now was an audience to the unraveling of my mind. I turned to find the boy sitting there. Choosing my words carefully, I shakily asked, "Where did you come from?" The boy's eyebrows lowered before his reply. "Where did you come from?" "Where's my dad?" he asked. It was a legit question, perfectly reasonable under the circumstance, but a question of course I couldn't answer. Just then I noticed he was starting to cry. This felt so wrong. Why was my hallucination sat here crying to me? Just then a hefty dose of reality hit me in the form of a loud horn of an approaching bus. I looked to my side mirror to see a very pissed-off driver giving me a sort of look you wouldn't give your worst enemy. I looked to the back seat once again to find it completely empty. Okay, it's official, I thought. I've lost my fucking mind. The sad realization washed over me depressingly as I thought it best before anything else I complete my journey to my parents. As I entered my parents' home, I was relieved to find both Mum and Dad sitting at the kitchen table with my cup of tea at the ready. But before I could even think about reaching for it, my heart broke. I started crying. A grown man crying in front of his parents. I felt so much shame in myself for breaking down this way in front of them. My father walked over and put his arms around me. "Hey, come on, lad," he quipped, trying to be chirpy. "Your mother has told me what happened," he admitted. I sat down in the chair and wiped my face. "It happened again on my way home. I think I'm seeing things," I said grimly. As I sat there drinking my tea and relating the worst morning of my life to very concerned-looking parents, I noticed that my mother kept looking to my father, specifically when I mentioned the red cap. When I finished my story, I felt calmer, more at ease, but then again, I am British, and it's amazing what a good cup of tea can do for the mind and body. My mom spoke first. "Son, I think you might not be hallucinating," she said reassuringly. "I mean, yes, if it carries on happening, then we go see a doctor, but there's something your dad should probably tell you first." She finished looking to my old man. My father looked at me and sighed, and then back to my mother. "He even has the same coat," he laughed in what looked like disbelief. Mom gave Dad a stare, and his attention was quickly brought back to me. "What are you talking about?" I asked, looking over at my quilted burgundy coat that was now hanging on the side of my chair. "Back when I was young, my father, your grandfather, used to take me to football practice every Sunday," he said with a smile as he remembered. I already knew this story. My dad played football well into his teens before meeting my mother. One day on my way to practice, I had fallen asleep in the back of the car. I had a late one the night before, you see, so I was knackered. He looked at my mother again for reassurance, and she nodded. "When I woke up, I found myself in someone else's car," he said again. "What?" I asked in shock. I remember being so terrified. One moment I was there watching my father drive. My eyes started getting heavy, and the next thing I know, this strange man is in front of me and we're driving somewhere I've never seen before. He took hold of my mother's hand and squeezed it. It had happened 3 times in total, and your grandparents thought I dreamt it after falling asleep in the car. I thought it was just my imagination, but it felt so real, he finished. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This entire ordeal sounded like something out of the Twilight Zone, but I could see it in my parents' faces and my father's tone. This wasn't a wind-up. This was a serious discussion. "What did the man look like?" I asked, while having a feeling that I already knew the answer. "Well, I was only 8 years old at the time. The memory has faded somewhat, but I do remember what his coat looked like." He finished by pointing at my coat over on the chair. Hi there. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have a story that you would like to have featured on this channel, whether it's paranormal, let's not meet, or even if it's fictional, send it to ReadingRubyYT@gmail.com, along with express consent for me to feature it here and your name as you would like it featured on this channel. That email address will be listed in the description below. So, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't be shy about sharing this channel with your friends who enjoy a good spook, and stay safe out there.